Hello, everybody. Back again. We're looking at round 12 from the Tata Steel Chess Tournament. Today's most important game was played between Anish Giri, who is leading the field right now in the Penty Ultimate round of this tournament. And he had the white pieces, and with the black pieces, we have the young, popular upstart Grandmaster Alireza Firouzja playing a French defense. As usual, people, please support my channel, clicking on the links below, like and subscribe, and please share my videos and post them, and that will improve the viewership of my channel. I would greatly appreciate that. Before I even get started in analyzing this, I want to give a shout out to one of the viewers, Sugar Bear Chirac, once again telling me who the anonymous player is that I always present in the last video. It was Natalie Zukova. So he got that. So I want to give a shout out to him. And again, whoever's the first one to let me know who this player is, the female player right above me, I'll give them a shout out in the next video. And also feel free if you want to see some content, let me know. I probably have it on my channel somewhere. I'll be glad to take some time, post some additional content for your participation in the channel. All right, so let's get right at it. Right into it, rather. So we have this French defense on the board. Giri plays e5 here in this classical system. Knight fd7, f4. So all typical stuff. c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e3. So we can see, again, white playing on the king side, black playing on the queen side. Real simple stuff. We had this pawn chain. This stuff has been played over and over and over again. Black expanding on that side of the board, white expanding on his side of the board. a3, c takes, knight takes, and now bishop c5 here. Queen d2 by Giri. Castles, and now bishop e2, queen c7, castles, b6. Couple of exchanges before we get to the meat of the game here. And now b4. Of course, the fight is over this d4 square, of course, and white wants to keep control of the center. Queen takes e3, bishop b7. So you can see here black is trying to do something about his traditionally bad bishop in the French that's trapped behind these light squares. So right now he introduces the obvious tactic of playing the discovered attack with d4. And okay, he's going to threaten mate on g2, but of course he knows Giri's not going to be mated, but he'll be able to liberate that bishop. So this is one way that black deals with that problem. Bishop d3, and now d4, and you can see what I was talking about there. Queen e4, and we enter into this end game. Now after knight takes e4, bishop d5, knight g5, and now black has a choice between g6 and h6. Let me go back here also, because possible was also just bishop takes e4. And I believe this move might have even been better, because with the position being closed like this, it seems like it's, well, not seems, the position is definitely more conducive to knights at this point. For instance, after bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, you can see how the white knight would have this access, at least temporarily, to the d6 square. Black would have to make several moves in order to get rid of it, probably consisting of undermining the e5 pawn with moves like f6 and f takes e5. But it's interesting alternative nonetheless. Now Giri decided to keep the bishop, and you can't go wrong with that either, because the position is open enough to where the bishop can prosper, and you'll see that in this game. So at this point, g6 or h6. Firouzja goes with g6. H6 is more aggressive, And I think it's a little bit less weakening because it doesn't weaken the dark squares around the king as much. And h6 is more aggressive because it actually kicks back the knight. So, for example, h6, knight f3, bishop takes f3, rook takes f3, and let's say b5, rook d1, rook d8, a4, and you can see how the bishop starts coming to life here. Knight b6, but black has enough counterplay, right on cue with f6. And this is just a sample line of the type of play that you would have in this bishop versus knight scenario here if black chose to play h6. And of course, you always have to be careful when you're making a choice between bishop versus knight because the position may open up later, or your opponent will play aggressively to turn the position in a way where it's conducive to his particular minor piece. Anyway, Firouzja plays g6, and you can see again the weakness exacerbated on f6, h6, and d6. All right. So knight f3 is played here. I think bishop e4 was better. Again, I feel like in this position, white rather should try to exploit the weakness of the dark squares. So bishop e4, this is a forced trade because white is already threatening to exchange on d5, doubling the pawns, and black doesn't want that to happen because then it would be easy to just round up those double pawns by doubling up on the d file. So bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, and you can see where I have highlighted the penetration points of the white knight. And I also have highlighted on c3 and e3 the potential outpost for the black knight. Notice it's much more difficult for black to get his knight down to c3 or e3 than it is for the white knight to jump into d6 or f6. All right. Another thing is the black pawn on the d file is isolated, so it's not an even situation here, and white's knight is definitely better. So play could continue rook a c8, rook a d1, and of course eventually the c and d pawns will be traded. But guess what? The e pawn will still be there on e5, and white will still have his outpost. Black won't have his. So I definitely believe that was a better continuation. Anyway, Giri stuck with his idea and kept the bishop on the board. Knight f3. Firouzja quickly got rid of the stalker of the d4 pawn, that knight. And now he goes into this particular ending where it's knight versus bishop. b5, bishop e4. And again, Giri's bishop is strong also. Starts piling up on the isolated pawn. Bishop b7. And again, you can see now as the position opens, the bishop gets stronger and stronger. Knight a4. Okay, the knight is moving up the board, but is that a stellar position for the knight? Of course not. Bishop takes a6. Knight c3, so the knight proves itself somewhat. Now bishop b7. Knight e2 check. King f2, knight takes f4. Rook d2, d3. So you can see both minor pieces, all right, are having their day in the sun. It's not like the knight is bad or the bishop is bad. Both pieces are stating their arguments for relevancy in this position. So d3 is played by Firouzja. The idea is, of course, if c takes d3 here, then knight d3 check, and you can see that the pawn is going to be captured on e5 afterward. This is why Giri played c3 during the game. And of course, his idea is just to kick the knight out, hopefully, and again, double up on the pawn and win it. So knight e2, and you can see Firouzja always has just enough counterplay. So now he's like, okay, you take the d pawn, I'll take the c pawn. All right. So king e3, and there it is. So this worked out for Firouzja, right? He got rid of that weak advanced Isolani, and for the in exchange for the C pawn. Rook D3, king takes, knight A4, and now rook C1. Rook D8 check from Firouzja. King E2, king G7, bishop C6. Again, bishop is being felt. So now you can see how strong this bishop is. It definitely looks like Giri made the right choice when you compare the bishop to the knight at this point, right? Notice the position is opened up significantly since 10, 12 moves ago. Now the rook of Firouzja that is forced into passivity, and this is where the grind starts, right? The technique of Giri. This is a type of position right here, right? A small advantage, and just keep turning the screws. Rook C2, King F8, King D2, King E7, King C1. King C1 is a fantastic move because what it does is it gets white off the line of checks, and also it prepares eventually the advance of these pawns. There's 2-1 majority on the queen side over here. King C1 right now gets out of the D file, gets away from checks, because if you look at this position, black is almost in Zugzwang. He really can't move his knight without either the knight being captured or losing the pawn. If he goes to B6 with the knight, he loses the pawn. All right, he can't really move his rook around too much without, again, losing the pawn. The only kind of move he has with his rook is like B6, rook to B6 or something like that. So the positional squeeze is on here. All right, so F6, right? This is a move, of course, Firouzja wouldn't really want to make, but he has to take away that space that Giri has. So in exchange for that, he takes on another isolated pawn. King F6, King B1, King E5, King A2, and black's king marches toward the center. His piece is really kind of handicapped here. King B3, King D3. And now here's an important move in the game. Giri plays the move Rook F2 with the obvious idea of penetrating to the 7th rank. Another way he could have did it was just play Bishop F3, and then move his Rook to C7. So again, here's a sample line. Play could go E5, and now Rook C7. Let's say E4, and now Rook D7 is very strong. And the reason why Rook D7 is very strong here is because the black king is forced to blockade his own pawn. Notice the position of the white king on B3 prevents black from going to the C file, so he only can go to the E file, which blocks the advance of the pawn. So after King E3, then just Rook E7, and you pick up the pawn. Let's say Rook C7, for example, with the idea of Rook C3 check. Now you just pick up the pawn. Rook C3. And this is good for white, right? Because the most dangerous element is out of off the board, which was that passed pawn. So Bishop F3 was interesting. Giri plays Rook F2, which was also good, and it's understandable to see that Giri would like to maintain pressure on the pawn on B5, because if he moves Bishop F3, the pawn on B5 is no longer attacked. E5, and there goes that passer. And Rook F7, powerful move, getting on the 7th rank, of course, attacking the H pawn, also threatening moves like Rook to B7, just simplifying everything, right? White would love to go into just a bishop knight ending at this point. Okay. Also, the B pawn would be attacked. Also, another idea is just bishop takes B5, But um, black saving grace here is that past e pawn, and if that past e pawn. Now, if you were watching the game earlier, you will see how how Firouzja used that e pawn, um, to just such a great effect. I mean he really maximized the use out of that pawn. But in this sample line, if he takes rook takes b5, rook f3, we can throw that in there. And this passed pawn is gonna save black. This variation. I heard GM Hess say, right, he was talking about these pawns, and he says it's not the quantity, it's the quality. Because Giri, has a lot of pawns, but that pass pawn is very, very dangerous. All right. So bishop takes b5 was possible, but not as good as the game continuation. So rook f7, and now, wow, I had to give this move an exclamation mark just because of the practicality of it. Okay. At this point, it at this point, Firouzja is very close to just being flat out lost. So it's like he has to do something. For example, if he plays just e4, for example, rook d7 with the same ideas that I just presented to you, the king is forced in front of the pawn, and you can see the bishop is already attacking the pawn. So the king is forced in front of the pawn either on e3 or e2, and then the rook just simply returns to the e file and captures the pawn. Simple as that. So e4 is out of the picture. He can't play rook b6 here, but then just bishop takes b5, rook takes b5, and rook d7. Again, with the same idea, forcing the king in front of the pawn. And now king e3, king takes a4. And with the extra tempo, right, having that the white king has on a rook has to move, and those pawns will roll forward. That's what Firouzja is faced with here. So with those variations, he just goes for it. Knight b6. So he's sacrificing the b pawn for counterplay, right? Getting his knight back in the game, and he's banking on this passed pawn. All right. Another thing that he does with knight b6 is he also covers the d7 square. And remember, I kept showing you the variation where the rook comes, checks, and drives the king over to the e file, forcing him to block his own pawn. This move, knight b6, prevents that. So now the pawn can just run freely without the rook being able to check there. So bishop takes b5, and now king d4. Notice, not in front of the pawn, on the side of the pawn. So here, again, for all intents and purposes, Giri should be winning, but maybe his nerves are getting to him, time pressure, whatever. He plays a4, decent move, but it's not as strong. Stronger was just take the pawn. Rook takes h4. And now, if he plays knight d5, bishop c6. Bishop c6 is very strong because it has the idea of pinning the knight now, right? The rook comes back to d7, as you can see, and it also frees the pawns to run up the side of the board. All right. So instead of knight d5, e4, again, bishop c6, king c2, king e5, rook h4, cutting the king off, cuts the rook off, and now the pawn gets attacked. And without that passed pawn, black really doesn't have anything. So rook takes h7 is probably better, but a4, I wouldn't say that's the culprit, but for what would take place. But let's see, a4, knight d5, rook takes h7 now, e4. So this pawn is not being properly supervised. So now Giri goes into some passive play here. Again, probably more aggressive with just rook h6, going after this pawn, say g5, rook c6, e3, check, and white is playing like he's in control. To me, these moves are a bit passive. Rook f7 and then rook f1. And now black is kind of doing what he wants to do here. Knight c3. And now Alireza has gotten a counterplay that he looked for when he sacrificed that pawn and played knight b6. Rook f4 check, king e5, rook f3, and now knight takes b5. Another important moment for Giri. If Giri plays a takes b5, now all of a sudden it's black who's in control. Remember, it's not the quantity of the pawns, it's the quality. That passed pawn is a killer. So now black is the one with winning chances after this. Therefore, when knight takes b5 is played, Giri simply play rook takes e3. And now he has 3 pawns for the knight. King d4, rook g3, and now knight d6. Rook takes g6. All right, so this is the best result black could have hoped for, right? He's gotten a piece in exchange for his passed pawn, right? And he still lost here. So black is still in trouble in this position. However, Giri's not an engine, so we have to play. Knight e4, a5, the pawns start marching, king d5, a6, knight c5, check, king a3, knight d3. All right, so you can see the double attack on the b pawn there, a7, rook a8, rook g7, and it's looking really scary, right? The rook is basically confined to just guard duty there, and white still has 2 free pass pawns on the other side of the board. King c6. So Firouzja rushes over there with this king to win this pawn, and this was a mistake by Giri because he just basically drops the pawn. h4, knight f4, g4, knight e6, hitting the knight, and the idea, hitting the knight, hitting the rook. The idea here is just simply to block the rook's influence on the 7th rank. So the rook defends itself, but now knight c7, and now that pawn is just going to drop. g5, rook takes a7, check. So black has a free move, and he just goes to rook a8. So now that he's dealt with that dangerous passed pawn that Giri just dropped for all intents and purposes, now he's going to shift his attention on these 2 passers on the king side. So g6, now knight e6, h5, rook h8, rook h7, guarding the h pawn, of course, and now rook to g8, and the players agreed on a draw. So you might say, why draw here? Well, the reason why that these players draw is because black will always be able to sacrifice his knight for those 2 pawns. All right, and then with the rook and king endgame, he can enter into a Philidor position from here. If you don't know what the Philidor position is, I'll post a link at the end of the video explaining it in detail, and you'll never be in the dark about exactly what the Philidor position is and how to set it up and everything. It's very useful in the end game to know that particular rook ending. So I'll just give you an example of how it could end up. So again, the players agreed to a draw here, right? And I know Giri was just just distraught over that because he could have secured his victory in the tournament. Now he's a half point ahead. Anything can happen in the next round, so he really has to just pull it together and forget about this game. Meanwhile, Firouzja is probably celebrating. He's probably on cloud 9. He can take that momentum into the next round and even win. All right. In favor for Giri is that he has one of the lower rated players in the tournament. I think Giri plays Anton next. So Giri is going to have to, again, set this game aside and focus on that immediately. But let me give you a sample line. So let's say king b3 and knight f4. G7, and now just knight takes H5. Let's say rook H6, king B7, rook takes H5, so it gets the knight back. The pawn drops, and now you can see white has an extra pawn, but there's no way that he is going to be able to win. His king is not in the the right place. The white king needs to be in front of the pawn and needs to be able to control those critical squares, which he's not going to be able to do with the position of the king, and also with the rook being able to check from the side and the bottom. So rook H6, rook G4. Again, these are just some sample moves. So rook G3, king B4, and then rook G1. And then you just get behind when the king gets ready to cross up the board. Then you just bring the rook down. So you check from the side and then bring the rook behind the king. But like I said, I'm gonna post a full tutorial on the Philidor's defense. But this position is gonna be a dead draw. For anybody that basically knows the defense. You can even draw with the Philidor's Philidor's ending with the king. The king can be on the back rank, and with the white rook can be on the 7th rank, and you still draw with the rook behind. So it's easy draw. Very disappointing loss for Giri and his fans, of course. It was interesting watching his wife commentate on the game and seeing the victory slip away. I wonder what she was thinking during the game. But anyway, like I said, that is it for this video. Please like, comment, subscribe. Push the video along in popularity on YouTube. Check my links below. Please support my channel. Donate to my channel. Also, there's some books, DVD links. This is a great book here. I think you can see it. Chess Middle Games. This is one of my favorite books. I studied this thing through the years. I've had this book for years. It might be out of print now, by Laszlo Pogar. And you can see how thick it is too. This book is like a Bible. It's not a book that you could just read and like you put down and say, "Hey, I read Chess Middle Games." You have to go back over it, over and over and over again. And what I like about it is all the tactical themes are divided up, by topic. So you might have opening up lines, sacrifice on G6, sacrifice on F6, sacrifice on H6, just blowing up the center, weakness of isolated pawn, strength of isolated pawn. So I posted some links below, but this particular book is out of print right now, the hardcover, so maybe you could get it used or something like that. But check the other links for middle game information like that. So anyway, that is it. Oh, and again, if you know who that player is, I'll be the first to drop a line in the comments below, and I'll be glad to shout you out in the next video. And I'll see you guys on the next one.